Welcome to Pax Britannica. The Windrush Scandal with Dr Juanita Cox. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Today, I'm very glad to present an interview with Dr. Juanita Cox. She is a research fellow at the University of London's Institute of Historical Research and worked on a project called the Windrush Scandal in a transnational and Commonwealth context. Dr. Cox will explain the Windrush Scandal in more detail, but as a brief introduction, it was a political scandal which hit the headlines in 2018. It emerged that for years, British citizens of Caribbean heritage, many of whom had lived in the UK for most of their lives, many of whom had been born in Britain, had been subjected to appalling treatment by the state, up to and including illegal incarceration and deportation. The Windrush generation, the post-war migration of West Indians who gained the label from one particularly famous ship, the Empire Windrush, were major victims of this scandal. The 22nd of June is Windrush Day, and it seemed appropriate to release this interview today. One of the things that the project highlights is that the origins of the scandal go much further back than the 2010s, and as part of this project, Dr. Cox spoke to many people about events dating from the 1950s. I met Dr. Cox at an event where she was speaking about the project, and even though the narrative of Pax is currently 3 centuries away from the arrival of the Empire Windrush at the port of Tilbury, I thought it was well worth inviting her on to speak about it. If you want to learn more about the project, you can go to windrushscandal.org to find out more and listen to the interviews. Dr. Cox, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, to start off with an easy question, why did you decide to become a historian?
It's not an easy question. It's not an easy question for me. My undergraduate degree was in Caribbean Studies, and I wrote a PhD on Edgar Mittelhauser, who's a 20th century writer from British Guyana. So the thesis was on the shaping of his novels. And so I suppose that's a form of kind of textual history. And some people have sort of referred to me as a textual historian, especially since I was interested in his historical juncture and the influence of cultural texts on his works. But I also took a largely interdisciplinary approach to his work, and I'm very interested in literature. So I'd say that really I'm still at the beginning of my academic career. Even though I completed my PhD in 2013, I didn't actually start working at the University of London until I think 2019. And so I don't feel as if my kind of academic identity is fully formed as yet. But all I know is I like storytelling, and I see history as being intimately kind of connected to that. Whereas fiction isn't really the opposite of fact, but it's complementary to that. Obviously, we locate our private stories within larger collective narratives. And both of those things are about helping us to understand the world we live in. I guess my academic identity kind of straddles literature as well as history.
Interesting. I think I can hear hints of possible answers to my next question in what you just said, because I wonder if you could explain to listeners what exactly the Windrush Scandal is or was, and what your project is intended to accomplish.
Some people will recall that there was a scandal that was forced onto the political agenda in April 2018 during the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in London. And it was during this period that it became clear that members of the Windrush generation and their descendants had been denied citizenship, detained and or deported. Those people were said by Amber Rudd to be British in all but legal status, and that the British government was going to right the wrongs. I mean, some of them were put in detention centres, they were denied their citizenship. So the project's kind of overarching focus is to explore the links between what we normally see as kind of apparently disparate spheres of international diplomacy and community activism, and kind of provide insights into the sort of unconventional methods of public diplomacy that are employed by Caribbean representatives and the ways in which international support enhanced and amplified community-based campaigning and investigative reporting. I think for me, a lot of my focus has been on really understanding the networks that were built in order to help force the scandal onto the political agenda. And just in terms of the project itself, which is called the Windrush Scandal in a transnational and Commonwealth context, it's been a 3-year project that was funded by the AHRC. And what we decided to do was to use a mixture of oral and archival history. That was then broken down, I guess, into 2 separate camps, as in I dealt with the national context and my colleague, Dr. Eve Hayes de Calaf, dealt with the transnational side of the project. So I ended up interviewing 30 people who were either victims of the scandal or their advocates. So people like church elders, journalists, MPs, councillors, activists, community associations, sort of a wide range of people. And then my colleague Eve interviewed largely diplomats, museum officials in the Caribbean, academics in the Caribbean, but also people who had been locked out by the changes in immigration legislation. And then the idea has then been to make those recordings accessible as far as possible to the public. We've then uploaded those to a website, windrushscandal.org, but we're also going to be depositing the WAV and MP3 formats of those recordings at the Black Cultural Archives, where they'll be more easily accessible by the Black community.
Fascinating. So my next question is kind of cheating a little bit, because I did hear you speak about this at the workshop where we met. Because I want to ask about terminology and the use of terms like Windrush generation and Windrush scandal. How do the participants in your interviews, how do they feel about that name?
One of the approaches to doing the oral history interviewing was to think about how people wanted to define themselves. So I didn't want to sort of come along and say, oh, I spoke to a Black British Caribbean person about X, Y, and Z. I wanted whoever I interviewed to be able to define themselves and tell me how they wanted to be spoken about in the work that we produce. So one of the questions that I asked in every interview was, how did people feel about the term Windrush generation? And was it a term they used? Was it a term that they embraced? And what I found was that there was a really wide range of responses to the question. And I remember one particular woman who had been born in Britain but was of Barbadian heritage. She said to me that she couldn't understand the term at all, because she said Windrush is a ship. Her family hadn't turned up on that ship. So why the Windrush ship? Why not the Almanzora? Why not the ship that transported her ancestors from Africa to the Caribbean? Why not any one of the ships that used to go between various ports in the Caribbean to Britain? And then on top of that, she was like, but what about all those people who came by plane? She just really saw it as an almost a dehumanizing term. And she had said that she referred to herself as a Black British Caribbean of African heritage. So I thought that was quite interesting. And I went on then to interview other people, including members of the community who've been kind of at the forefront of discourse around the term Windrush generation. So, for example, I spoke to Arthur Torrington, who co-founded the Windrush Foundation with Sam King. Now, Sam King was a man who had served in the RAF during the Second World War, and he had actually travelled back from Jamaica to the UK on the Windrush. And I think in 1968, 20 years after he had arrived, he decided to find out what other passengers on the Windrush ship were up to. He wanted to know how they'd fared and how they'd got on. So he put an advert in the paper asking people to come forward. And that really marks the beginning of this idea of the Windrush generation, because he then saw it as something to celebrate, to mark their achievements, to mark their involvement in the Second World War. He also became, I think he was the mayor of Lewisham, if I may be mistaken, but I think he's the mayor of Lewisham. And in that capacity, he was then able to put on events that marked what he then termed Windrush Day, which became the 22nd of June. And he had an event, I know, certainly on the 22nd of June in 1998. And 1998 is around about the same time that Trevor Phillips and his brother Mark Phillips wrote the book Windrush, The Irresistible Rise of Black Britons. And they sort of talk about this Windrush spirit. That Windrush generation, or Windrush generations, in effect, really, because it wasn't just adults that arrived on that ship, it was also young children. But that Windrush generation that arrived on the ship then becomes extended to what's known as pioneers with the spirit of Windrush. But then some time later, I think about 2010, Patrick Vernon started campaigning for Windrush to become a sort of national day. And he campaigned for that. And then that then emerges. Theresa May, I think, then announces that, yes, for 2018 onwards, there would be a Windrush Day to mark the migration of people from the Caribbean to the UK in the period between 1948 and 1971, which 1971 is when the 1971 Immigration Act is passed, and when that more or less brings an end to the free movement of people from the Commonwealth into the UK. But there's a lot of contention with the community about the term Windrush, and I notably interviewed someone with very close associations to the Black Cultural Archives, and she had arrived in the UK in 1958 from Jamaica, and I thought that automatically would have made her a member of the Windrush generation. And when I suggested that, it was immediately refuted because she said, no, mine was a different experience. I didn't come here for work. I came here for education. I came from a middle-class background. So there seems to have been some sort of nuance there where people from the Windrush generation are perceived as people who came to help rebuild Britain post the Second World War, but also people who are perhaps largely from working class backgrounds who were also in need of work. But yes, as I say, the boundaries of the term Windrush kind of keep shifting, because there's also the problem that if we go by setting a boundary with the 1971 Immigration Act, then what about all those other Caribbean territories that were still colonies of Britain? I think, for example, St. Kitts didn't become independent until 1983. Antigua and Barbuda didn't become independent until 1981. So does that mean people coming from the Caribbean during that period, and of course they still had the right to come as British subjects into the UK after the 1971 Act, so are they not part of the Windrush generation? It sounds like a very straightforward term when you initially hear it and you hear it bandied about, the Windrush generation. But actually it's a bit more complex than that, because who are we actually talking about? And I think really it boils down to, when you're talking about the Windrush generation, quite often it's a majority Jamaican population that arrived here before 1971, and that's normally the cohort that people are talking about.
That's really interesting. It's fascinating that you found this self-identification that didn't necessarily mesh with a broader umbrella for very valid reasons. You pointed out the difference between former Caribbean colonies that were still colonies after the 1971 Act. I don't know if the project reached out to them or spoke to many of them, but did you find that they had a term for themselves?
They actually assume they're part of the Windrush generation as well. And I think that's largely due to their date of arrival. So I think I haven't interviewed anyone I can think of the top of my head who arrived in Britain, say, in 1981. You know, everybody that we interviewed arrived largely in the 60s, maybe one or two in the 70s, or maybe one or two in the 50s, but you're primarily looking at the 50s, 60s and 70s as the time period in which they arrive. And so I think they feel that they are part of that Windrush generation literally because of the period in which they arrived, rather than the period in which their territory became independent.
And that leads me to another question. One of the things about the scandal you mentioned earlier is that there was a serious gap in essentially their legal status. So with the people that weren't officially, quote unquote, part of the Windrush generation, but were, former British subjects, did they come into any kind of difficulty in that sense?
Yes, in some ways it was worse. It's so complicated because really there's two groups of people we're talking about. There's those people who were members of the Commonwealth, who had freedom of movement, freedom to enter Britain without immigration control up until 1962. A few legislative changes occurred with the 1962 Immigration Act, 1968 and 1971. That's the Commonwealth, those people who were largely dominions. So, for example, Jamaica became independent in 1962. They pretty much obtained what they viewed as dominion status. And so even though Jamaicans automatically lost their British subject status when Jamaica became independent, they still had freedom of movement in the UK up until 1971. And so people who were living and settled here didn't even realize there had been a change to their status, and they will only have really noticed there was a change to their status if they traveled overseas after 1971. So, for example, I arrived from Jamaica in 1961 as a British subject, and I have a 10-year passport. If I then had traveled, actually, it wouldn't quite work with Jamaica because the passports are valid for 10 years. So that would mean I'm coming back in the UK in 1971. And actually, the 1971 Act doesn't come into play until the 1st of January 1973. But I think you get the hint already from what I'm saying. It's complicated. But essentially, if you were from the Commonwealth, the freedom of movement you had to either settle or move to the UK is severely restricted by the 1971 Immigration Act. But what then happens is, if you were settled in the UK, you have the option to then register as British or to naturalise as British. Many people would have decided to take Jamaican passport and then been given indefinite leave to remain. That's sort of the status we tend to see amongst the earlier cohort that gained independence in the earlier periods, like Trinidad and Tobago. But with territories that got their independence after the 1971 Act, things became more complicated. And I think what's important to recognise is that different islands negotiated different terms or agreed different terms of independence. So what we found with people from St. Lucia is, for example, there's a man who arrived in the UK from St. Lucia in the 1950s. He arrived on a colony of St. Lucia British passport. I mean, he's lived here all of his life. And in 1971, he was told that he should register as British in the UK and get a British passport. So that's what he did. And he thought that would secure his position in the UK. But actually, what then happens is that St. Lucia becomes independent in 1979. And in the terms that were agreed, anybody from St. Lucia who had been settled in Britain automatically lost their British subject status with the gaining of St. Lucia's independence. And there weren't any arrangements for St. Lucians to be able to apply for or register as British without having first applied for a St. Lucian passport. A lot of St. Lucians didn't realise they had lost their British citizenship status. They thought because they'd registered in 1971 or whenever that they were fine. So, for example, you may have seen in the newspapers there was a gentleman called Richard Black. He had been born in St. Lucia and moved to the UK as a toddler, essentially. I think he was 3 or maybe 6. But certainly he went to primary school in the UK, secondary school. And he had applied for a British passport in 1978 and then carried on with life as usual. He was a photographer and then had married a woman whose family lived in Trinidad. So in 1979, he then travelled to Trinidad to visit her ailing parents. They stayed longer than they had planned because her parents were ill. And by the time they were due to return to the UK, his British passport had expired. So when he went to the British Embassy, he was then told, no, you're not British anymore, so we can't help you. Now, he's not from Trinidad. He'd never had a St. Lucian passport, and all of a sudden he's told that now that his British passport's expired, there isn't anything he could do. He has no right to return to the UK. Whatever the case was, he ended up being locked out of the UK for over 40 years. He remained in Trinidad. The problem then became that he had 2 children with his wife who were British born. His wife and his children returned back to the UK. Ironically, his wife actually got her British citizenship status from him, having been British, because wives took on the status of the husband. So they were able to return to the UK, but he wasn't. Because he wasn't able to return, the marriage breaks down. They eventually get divorced. he loses his livelihood. He becomes destitute. He lived on the streets of Trinidad. He had no idea how to get a St. Lucian passport because he didn't have his birth certificate. He didn't have any paperwork. Yeah, luckily for him, he eventually made friends in the community in Trinidad, and people kind of helped him rebuild his life over a number of years. And then he became self-educated. And then I think when the Windrush Scandal actually broke, that's when he reached out to the Home Office here and said, well, how do I get my British citizenship back? In the intervening periods between the Home Office saying he wasn't British and the Windrush Scandal, his mother, who was resident in England, had fallen ill. She was dying. He tried on numerous occasions to come back to kind of help her through her illness. He wasn't allowed to. She died. She had her funeral here. He still wasn't allowed to come back. And he'd been very close to his mother. So the experience of that had been very devastating. But all of that is just to sort of highlight the point that it becomes very complex, because I think when I initially started working on the Windrush Scandal, and because of the way we always talk about Anglophone Caribbean as a sort of block, I'd assumed they would all have had the same experience of decolonization. I'd assumed that they'd all been given the same severance terms, if you like. But they weren't, because what I've subsequently found out is that under the 1981 Constitution of Antigua and Barbuda, exceptions were made. So although Antiguans living in Antigua lost their British subject status when they gained independence, those Antiguans who were living and settled in the UK at the point of independence were conferred an automatic right to dual citizenship. They had the right to apply for an Antiguan passport. They had the right to apply for a British passport, but without having to go to the trouble of, oh, hang on a minute, I've got to lose my subject status and then apply for an Antiguan passport and then, apply and see if I'm able to get British citizenship. They were just assumed to have access to both on independence.
To be honest, I'm stunned. I didn't know the full story of Mr. Black. That is horrifying. That is an appalling tale. I'm really curious because there's so much bureaucratic failing there and different diplomatic decisions being made and lots of moving parts that, almost seems a dispassionate event. But we've kind of not really touched on it yet, but there's got to be the role of racism involved in a lot of these decisions.
Even the government admits that, maybe not publicly, but I know that there was an article written by Amelia Gentleman, who's the investigative journalist who had been bringing the stories to the public's attention from about November 2017. But she wrote an article about an internal Home Office historian who had been tasked with writing a history of the changing legislation and the objectives of that legislation. And the report itself, which was leaked, explicitly admits to it being about minimising the number of black people in Britain. And it also explicitly admits that it didn't want people to be aware that the legislation was about minimising black people. It found different strategies to do that. And I'll give you an example. I mean, one of the things that really stunned me was I think it's the 1958 or 1959 Mental Health Act. On its introduction, what that allowed was for people who had mental health problems to be repatriated to the Caribbean on the grounds of, I say repatriated, I mean, essentially that's not true, deported to the Caribbean on the basis that their mental health challenges, if you like, would fare better if they got some sun. And we know from the work of people like Agri Burke that the Home Office would liaise with the high commissions here and notify them of the names of people that had been sectioned or who had been brought to their attention who had mental health difficulties, who were then deported. Actually, the really astonishing thing about it is that they were deported once they were deemed healthy enough to travel. So in other words, whatever depression, whatever mental health issue they had to have gotten better before they were then removed from the UK, and they were then sent to Bellevue Hospital in Jamaica. And we know that a lot of the people that were deported didn't have any family living there anymore. Like, their family was based here, that they may have been living in Britain for anything like 20 years. 10 years was fairly standard. They've been living here a long time. And some we believe committed suicide. Certainly we know some people drowned. Some of the circumstances are a bit vague, but we haven't been able to find out the details of those circumstances. But certainly it seems that some people committed suicide, whilst others actually just found ways of re-emigrating and went left Jamaica and went instead to the US, thinking or believing that may have been a less, I don't want to say less racist context, because I'm sure they knew it was as racist, but maybe that there was space for them to be able to get on with their lives. So there's certainly been practices all along. And also the other thing that really struck me was that before the 3-year Windrush Scandal project, we did a scoping project that was 6 months long. And during that period, I interviewed elders in the community because I was interested in why some people hadn't got caught up in the scandal. I just thought, well, okay, we've got this cohort of people that got caught up. Why didn't the others get caught up? So I asked them to talk me through their experience of travelling in and out of the UK. And one gentleman who came he was Indo-Guyanese, who had come to Britain from Guyana, I think in the early 60s. And he pointed out that actually it wasn't as, this idea that because you were a British subject, you had free rein to come and go as you please, which was what was supposed to have been the case, wasn't actually true, because you weren't able to get your documentation to travel if you didn't first get a justice of the peace to sign a form saying you were a person of good character. And in fact, he'd been asked to get, I think, 2 or 3 separate testimonies, of his character before he was able to get his paperwork. And that was, he found that funny because he was actually a policeman in Guyana. So he was like, I'm a policeman, I uphold the law, and yet still they were asking me for all this paperwork. But the other thing that I realize now is that the point of departure, there were also people who would be filtering whether or not you were fit to travel. So if an immigration officer sort of thinks, oh, well, you look like you might have a mental health problem, or you look like, for whatever reason, they could stop you from traveling. They could also be prevented from getting a British passport for whatever reason. And also the British government felt relatively comfortable initially in the 50s, after they'd passed the 1948 Nationality Act, because they thought that people in the Caribbean would never have the money or the wherewithal to make it to Britain. So it's clear all along there's this whole idea of the British Nationality Act conferring British subject status on members of the Empire and the Commonwealth was more about this kind of symbolic move rather than any real intent that people from the sort of new Commonwealth were going to come to Britain. And of course, there have been all sorts of bits of legislation subsequent to the British Nationality Act that helped to minimise it. So by 1962, if you wanted to come, you then had to get a work permit. And you could only get certain types of work. They assumed that people from particular demographic areas wouldn't have the qualifications and therefore wouldn't be able to then come into Britain on a work permit. But of course, that wasn't true either. And the other problem they had was that they then saw that obviously people who were already settled were bringing in their families. And so they then sought to work out, well, how can we prevent that? So they then brought in what was called a sole responsibility regulation, which particularly affected single-parent mothers. So if you're a single-parent mother and you had a child in Jamaica, you couldn't bring your child in on the basis that you had the sole responsibility for that child, because then they would say, yeah, but they're being taken to school by their grandmother, so you don't have sole responsibility, so the child doesn't need to come and join you. So yeah, there were all sorts of different techniques. I think the key thing for us at the moment is to establish, well, what's the function of these hostile environment practices? Are they a continuation of the government trying to minimise the number of black people in Britain? Is this just a continuation of the history that we know and legislation that we know was implicitly racist? Even if the intent isn't racist, certainly the outcome is racist. I'll give you a classic example. I mean, when the hostile environment policies were introduced by Theresa May, I think you'll remember Theresa May said that 2012, she announced we're going to be bringing in a really hostile environment with the intent of being able to deport undocumented migrants. But of course, what that meant is that black people in Britain are just being policed, that we become racialized because we are seen as non-British. And the actual concept of not being black and British actually deepens, because of these hostile environment policies. And I say that because I had experience of it myself, where I had got married and I went to my local GP to change my surname, and I had taken with me my birth certificate, my British passport, my marriage certificate, and I'd said, here's my documentation. And actually, I'd already changed my name in my British passport, and that had been accepted. But when I went to the surgery, they then said, no, we can't accept it. How do we know these are your documents? Now, I've been with the surgery for I don't know how long. They knew it was me, so I'm not really quite sure why they didn't accept my documents. But we see this kind of the emergence of guilty until proven innocent environment or culture within institutions whereby Black people have to prove their Britishness before it's accepted. And indeed, I had to go and get a lawyer to sign an affidavit to say that, yes, these were indeed my documents. I am indeed Juanita Cox, and etc., before they were willing to change it. And I'm not saying that that was a widespread experience for Black people. I don't know. I haven't asked people if other Black people experience being policed in that way. But certainly it is why more Black drivers of vehicles are stopped, because that is another mode of immigration officers being able to police nationality. So I think one of the things people aren't aware of is that border control is now intimately connected with police. Previously, they were kind of separate entities and they operated separately, but now they don't. And the same thing with the NHS. We saw with the Windrush Scandal, people who fell ill, had cancer, went to hospital for treatment, were then told that they had to pay a bill, £50,000 for their cancer treatment, even though they've been living here all their lives, because all the border control has moved from being on the borders of Britain to being within all the institutions of the UK. So within banks, schools, hospitals, obviously universities, all sorts of different environments. Of course, probably the most notable place is within work, because most of the people we interviewed actually realised that their status hadn't been or needed to be regularised because they lost jobs from the places they had been working in for 5, 10, 15, 20 years because they were suddenly asked to prove their British citizenship status. It has to be seen as racist because there's 11 million people in Britain without passports. And what are they doing? And how come they've got jobs? And how come they aren't being policed? For example, you now can't rent a property from a landlord without evidencing your British citizenship status. But the problem becomes that individuals and lay people in the community don't know what they're looking at. There's people from so many different territories living in Britain that individuals can't be expected to function as immigration officers and go, I'm looking at this piece of paper. Yes, that means you have a legitimate right to live in the UK. They're not going to know. So what tends to happen is that landlords will look at somebody based on their complexion and then decide, it's pretty obvious you come from somewhere that's not Britain. So therefore, we're not going to rent the property to you. And an offshoot of that, I think that's really appalling as well, is that it means that the government is using British citizens as part of this process. Because if you make an error and you do employ someone, if you make an error and you think someone's entitled to work in Britain and it turns out they're not, you can receive an enormous fine. In some cases, you can be criminalised, And so that means that lay people in the UK become nervous about dealings with official dealings with people of colour. And I have to say that my experience with the GP made me think that the woman I was dealing with was a racist, and until I started doing this project, I didn't realise it wasn't that she was racist, it was that the system was institutionally racist. That was a really important moment for me to understand that whilst I have gone through my life in Britain thinking individuals are racist, I now understand that in a lot of the situations that I've navigated where I felt that I was being racialised, I was actually being racialised by the system, not by the individual.
The first thing that came to mind when you started listing all the different ways that immigration is so heavily policed takes me back to my own studies on things like the language test, where immigrants, at least to Australia and that, they were coming from countries in Africa or colonies in Africa, and they were being quizzed in Welsh or Norwegian with the obvious intention that they weren't going to be allowed in. With the project, do you have any particular defined hopes of influencing policy?
That's an interesting question. Certainly when we started the project, I thought, we can think about policy recommendations for the Home Office, etc., etc. That's become pretty pointless. I mean, Wendy Williams did the Windrush Lessons Learned review, and, we were told by Priti Patel that her 30 recommendations would be taken on board, and I would have agreed with those recommendations. I think all of them were really important. But then when Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, came in, she went back on 3 of those recommendations, including the idea of having reconciliation events with the community, which I think is really important, but also having an a migrants minister, which I think is also really important, especially because there is a lot of amnesia around the circumstances under which certain groups of people came from different territories. And we're now in a state not of multiculturalism, but of super diversity. And so in a sense, it's even more important to have a migrants minister and somebody who's kind of paying attention to all the multiple factors and reasons that people are settled in Britain and have become British, but not necessarily white. There needs to be somebody there who is monitoring all of those changes and also working with the communities to notify them, for example, of changes to legislation. Certainly, one of the biggest issues, I think, when as the legislation was changing, one of the things that's really notable is that the British government really didn't make a great deal of effort to let people know what they needed to do. I mean, between 1983 and 1988, people who had arrived as British subjects, who were settled in Britain, were given the opportunity, the sort of explicit opportunity to register or naturalise as British between 1983 and 1988, but yet they didn't really advertise it properly. They were in touch with some community groups, or they were sending out leaflets to some community groups. Some councils took on board responsibility for letting members of the Caribbean diaspora know about the changes. But the reality is that it was largely, I mean, it depended whether you were reading maybe The Voice or the other sort of Caribbean newspapers that were sort of around in the 70s. But if you had 3 jobs and you had children and a family, you weren't necessarily reading those newspapers, you wouldn't have known that that's what you needed to do. So I suppose that leads then into something I have thought about doing as a part of a sort of a policy recommendation per se. But I do think it's really important that the project produces educational material that is very much targeted at the Black community, maybe as part of supplementary schools, something that helps people understand how they got into the situation they're in now, because a lot of people are still really confused. I mean, I was at an event maybe a year ago in Birmingham. One of the members of the audience sat there and said, I'm totally confused. This is my passport. Look at my passport. It says British. How is it you're telling me I'm not British now when it says on my passport I'm British? How does a person suddenly change who they are? And there's this complete misunderstanding and lack of knowledge around kind of legal citizenship laws, legislation. So I think there's something that we need to be doing to help, the British Caribbean community to sort of understand that history, the long history of the Windrush Scandal, but also I'm hoping that the material will become part of, it's a migration module, which I hope we'll be able to produce material for that schools can, secondary school teachers can access and then use, because, what's going on with the Windrush Scandal is really instructive for other communities. And I'd also say that the Windrush Scandal has revealed for me that there's an awful lot more going on than just what's impacting the Caribbean community. Where I live in London, I'm based in Woolwich, and there's a very large African-born community that is now settled in the UK, working in the UK, whose children are being born here, but whose children, under the 1981 Nationality Act, aren't automatically conferred British citizenship. There are instances, and I've certainly seen this in my own research, where I've met people who have been born and brought up in England, in Britain, who don't have a passport because they've never travelled outside of the UK, whose birth certificates show that they are British, born, but they're undocumented. They're essentially undocumented and they can't get work because they're undocumented. So I know of one gentleman, he's a brilliant artist actually, who's in his 30s, mid-30s now, and he's never been able to enter the formal economy because he doesn't have the right paperwork, even though he's never left the country, even though he doesn't know anywhere else but Britain, even though he's entirely British. I think what the Windrush Scandal does, as I say, it kind of exposes a lot of other problems in lots of other communities around the legislation. And, you know, it really brings to mind this thing that, you know, one of the top judges in Britain, Lord Bingham, Thomas Bingham, who wrote the Rule of Law 2010, where he said, you know, the law must be accessible and, so far as possible, clear and predictable. And of course, there is nothing clear, predictable, or accessible about immigration law in Britain. In fact, one of the biggest things that has really affected Caribbean diaspora communities living in the UK is something that's a rule within the indefinite leave to remain regulations. So say, for example, came from Jamaica as a child, lived in Britain, Jamaica becomes independent, I get a Jamaican passport, but with indefinite leave to remain in the UK stamped on the passport. I then have elderly grandparents who need my help, so I travel to Jamaica to help them. And, you know, maybe that means I need to be out of the country for 3 years as I help nurse them through their illness. The family prepare for their funeral and sort out their probate before I can come back to my life in the UK. But oh dear, no, that doesn't work, because under indefinite leave to remain legislation, anybody who's out of the country for more than 2 years loses their right to be in the UK. So that's in the kind of small print that most people were completely oblivious to. So as I mentioned before, my colleague Eve was dealing with the sort of transnational aspect of it. And that's largely where the community in Britain feels very hard done by, because, you know, brothers or a father or a mother or whoever, whichever member of the family may have travelled back, has ended up being locked out, and, you know, it's led to these kind of split families. So those are the kinds of things that I think are really important, that we corral that kind of information for the community, not just for the Windrush generation or the descendants of the Windrush generation, but for people from from the wider Commonwealth, people from other territories around the world, need to be aware about the small print in the legislation that we have in Britain. And they also need to be aware, as one of my respondents put it, that this can be the law today, tomorrow they may put a comma after it, and it's something completely different. And so your status, which at one point feels permanent, may not be permanent the next day. Recently, under Priti Patel, they brought in another Borders and Immigration Act that meant that I'm British and I travel overseas, and the government decides I don't have good character and they don't like me, they can withdraw my British citizenship status if I happen to be a dual national. So I won't even know it's been withdrawn until I try and come back into the UK. For many black people in Britain, they're living in a state of statelessness, and it's such a taboo subject. They don't have the money to seek legal support. Theresa May, as part of the hostile environment policy, actually withdrew legal aid for immigration issues. So there isn't a way anymore of getting help for any kind of immigration or, you know, / citizenship issues in the UK. I mean, if you don't have any money. And obviously, people who can't get work, can't get money, can't get legal aid. I don't know what the figures are for the number of people in the UK who are living in that state, but it's certainly significant. It's all about education, essentially, and just trying to protect the black community and raise their awareness of the types of situations that can impact them. And I know I'm going on quite long about this, but there's one other point I'd like to make, and that is that, for example, you can be in a situation where you're born here, brought up here, you haven't travelled anywhere else, but if you commit a crime and you gain a prison sentence of more than 1 year, you can also then be deported to whichever country your parent comes from. So there are cases of black Brits who've been deported from Britain. The impact on Jamaica, for example, is horrendous, because you've got a whole bunch of black Brits who've gone back to Jamaica, had mental health breakdowns because they don't know anybody there. They're separated from their families. Okay, they've committed a crime, but the reality is that this bit of legislation is resulting to them being over-policed, over-sentenced. We know that black boys tend to get much heavier sentences than white boys for the same crimes. And, you know, the question is, actually, is the reason for this that you can then be deported? You know, there's a lot of questions I think that this research has thrown up for me. And although I can't say in any kind of concrete way, oh, there's a definite line between the over-policing and over-sentencing on black boys, and this is definitely connected to the government's desire to minimize the number of black people in the country. I can't say there's a definite link to that, but that is what's happening.
Well, on that note, if listeners are interested in engaging with the project, where can they find the interviews? Where can they find the project itself?
So you literally just need to type in windrushscandal.org and it'll take you to our opening page, and you can find the extended interviews available on the website. We haven't completed uploading the interviews, and as I may have mentioned earlier, not all of them will be uploaded because we don't necessarily have permission from everybody that we interviewed. We've had permission to deposit all of the material in the Black Cultural Archives, but we don't necessarily have permission to put everything on the website. And of course, that's to do as well with the kind of political climate we're living in and the kind of culture wars and the anti-lawyer sentiments and things like that. So we've had to be quite careful about what material is on the website, but that is the first port of call.
Fantastic. Dr. Juanita Cox, thank you so much for coming on today and talking to me about this. This has been incredible.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's been brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
I hope you found this interview interesting. It's by far the most modern topic I've discussed on PAX, and I did question whether it fit. There's a fair gap between Oliver Cromwell and the Empire Windrush, after all, and that's before you consider questions about modern British policy, which might not be what you listen to Pax Britannica for. But just 2 days after speaking with Dr. Cox, another story broke of a man who has lived and worked in Britain for 50 years, and only recently discovered, in his retirement, that according to the Home Office, he has no right to live in the UK. After speaking with Dr. Cox, I wasn't even surprised. If you want to learn more about the Windrush Scandal project, go to windrushscandal.org. There are some incredible interviews with people ranging from the Caribbean diaspora, sitting British MPs, diplomats and ambassadors, retired officials who had active roles in the policies we've discussed, and modern-day activists on both sides of the Atlantic. That again is windrushscandal.org. Thank you to Dr. Juanita Cox for her time, to the Institute of Historical Research and the AHRC, and of course, to you for listening.